Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on, well, one of the most staggering failures of the American justice system in recent memory, a failure with implications that really stretch across global finance and politics, the handling of Jeffrey Epstein.
Mm-hmm. The source material lays out a truly horrifying record of abuse, followed by a kind of judicial leniency that just boggles the mind.
Exactly. And it leads us to this crucial question, one that really cuts to the integrity of the rule of law itself. Can the global economic and political elite literally purchase immunity from prosecution in the American justice system?
A deeply troubling question.
So we're debating the core nature of this breakdown, specifically that 2007 non-prosecution agreement, the NPA. Was the failure to pursue federal sex trafficking charges against Epstein and, importantly, hold his powerful network accountable, was this primarily a consequence of inherent, structural, maybe class and race-based dysfunction within the U.S. justice system? A two-tiered system favoring white male elites?
Or was it a singular, catastrophic misuse of basically unreviewable prosecutorial discretion by specific individuals?
Right. And I maintain that this scandal reveals a profound structural problem, one that actively protects the powerful.
And I'll take the opposing view. While the outcome is horrific and, yes, undeniably biased, I believe the failure stems primarily from the extraordinary and I think demonstrable abuse of individual prosecutorial power, actions that were actively illegal and violated established norms.
Okay, I see why you'd focus on individual misconduct. Figures like Alex Acosta certainly made, let's call them aberrant decisions. But I argue the Epstein case is just a perfect illustration of how the U.S. criminal legal process is structurally designed, almost, to construct white male ruling class innocence. This protective mechanism operates in really profound opposition to that perfected engine of hyper-incarceration we see reserved for vulnerable, often non-white communities. The system's default mode, I think, is leniency for the connected.
What makes you so sure it's the system's default setting, rather than, say, a particularly successful, high-level instance of corruption manipulating the system?
Well, look at the preferential treatment he received, and the sheer scope of protection offered by that NPA. It granted immunity not just to Epstein and his, immediate known accomplices, and this is key to any potential co-conspirators. That shields a potentially limitless number of wealthy elites. This structural wall of silence around let's call it the old boy network, that wasn't an accident. It feels like a deliberately constructed shield built by the state itself.
Rich was happening even as the U.S. system was zealously prosecuting black men, often with the full weight of federal tools like RICO, for trafficking or sometimes even minor, non-violent offenses. Think about R. Kelly's prosecution or the zealous pursuit of those 3 black ministers in Ohio using RICO. It just perfectly illustrates the system's willingness to deploy its full punitive power against the racialized other, but not against the white financier.
That comparison is compelling, I grant you. But the sheer illegality, the brazenness of the prosecutor's actions here suggests an anomaly to me, not a norm. I believe the failure stems primarily from specific, demonstrable abuses of individual discretion by figures like Acosta and the state attorney Barry Krischer. They ignored overwhelming evidence. They ignored established legal frameworks. They didn't just lean toward bias. They seem to have actively sabotaged the case.
How did they sabotage it, though, if not through a kind of systemic deference to his power and connections?
Well, the process itself was deliberately distorted, right from the start. Let's start locally with Krischer's office. He took a non-capital sexual violence case to a grand jury, which, is virtually unheard of under Florida law. Grand juries there typically only hear first-degree murder cases.
Okay.
But more importantly, instead of presenting evidence on the multiple victims already identified by Palm Beach police, and there were many, his office only presented evidence on one single victim, and then sought only one count of solicitation of prostitution. That charge fundamentally minimizes the crime. It ignores the legal reality that a minor cannot consent to sex. This feels like a clear, active choice to sanitize a perpetrator and pathologize the victim right from the get-go.
But isn't that choice the choice to sanitize the white, connected perpetrator and the resulting legal fiction that a minor was merely a prostitute, isn't that precisely what a structure of deference incentivizes? If the prosecutor, who, let's face it, controls the grand jury process, knows they'll face little scrutiny for going easy on an elite figure, well, that sounds like the system functioning as designed, not necessarily a one-off mistake.
I disagree that it was merely systemic apathy. I think it was specific, demonstrable legal misconduct. Look at Acosta's federal justifications for the NPA. He claimed federal law required proving Epstein crossed state lines with intent to commit the sex acts. That interpretation is, well, it's flatly legally incorrect. The federal trafficking statute section 1591 only requires that the activity affect interstate commerce.
Right.
I mean, if Epstein used a cell phone to schedule liaisons or bought a gift manufactured out of state for a victim, he met the jurisdictional bar. The 11th Circuit has made the standard incredibly clear. Acosta seemed to deliberately choose to ignore binding law to decline prosecution, and his decision to withhold notification from the victims, which violated the Federal Crime Victims Act, that wasn't structural apathy. That was an intentional, secret act of misconduct designed to insulate the deal.
That intentional, secret act. Okay, that brings us right back to the NPA itself. You call it individual misconduct. I still see it primarily as a structural shield. Was the unprecedented breadth of immunity, again, to any potential co-conspirators, was that merely an individual blunder? Or did its very design reveal its true structural purpose? Protecting that old boy network and ensuring a permanent wall of silence. The fact that powerful political figures, and we know the names swirling around, Trump, Clinton, Prince Andrew, Leslie Wexner were circling this operation, it just illustrates the immense political capital that must have been leveraged to make this, frankly, unique deal happen.
The involvement of high-profile names certainly demonstrates the motive for corruption, I agree, but not the inevitability of the system operating that way. The NBA was so outrageous that the DOJ itself later initiated an internal investigation into the process. The severity of Acosta's abdication, things like canceling grand jury subpoenas for Epstein's computers, keeping the deal secret, that was a conscious, negotiable failure of duty. Even a federal judge later suggested the government's attempts to release some sealed grand jury materials felt like they were aims at creating the illusion of transparency, not actually achieving it. That points to conscious individual corruption and abuse of that unreviewable discretion.
Well, if the NPA provided the legal structure for the protection, then we have to look at the economic power that perhaps built that structure in the first place. And this moves us to the role of financial and political power, doesn't it? Epstein amassed his fortune partially through, well, strange businesses like Towers Financial Corporation, a debt collection agency, and his very deep connection to L Brand CEO Les Wexner. He then systematically deployed that fortune to buy loyalty, reputation, access, massive donations to institutions like MIT and Harvard, hosting world-renowned intellectuals. Wealth provided the systemic infrastructure for his global operation. It allowed him to operate for decades.
You're making a strong case that wealth is the systemic enabler here.
Precisely, and the proof, for me, is that the state only selectively focuses its punitive power. We see the zealous pursuit of trafficking charges against those who are less networked, often primarily young black men. Meanwhile, the buyers of sex, who are frequently white, middle to upper class men providing the financial demand, they are dramatically under-prosecuted. This demonstrates a systemic choice about who warrants the state's full punitive attention.
I can't deny that wealth heavily influenced the outcomes here. But the fact that legal mechanisms are now being used, albeit late, to seek accountability suggests the system isn't entirely impervious. We're seeing these civil lawsuits filed by victims' attorneys against major financial institutions, BNY, Bank of America. These cases argue the banks provided the, quote, essential infrastructure for the illegal operations, basically by looking the other way. The lawsuits themselves, driven by the discovery process, are forcing disclosure.
But they only occurred because of immense, sustained external pressure, right? The source material documents the years-long strenuous investigative journalism, people like Julie K. Brown at the Miami Herald, and the public pressure of the #MeToo movement. That's what was necessary to even reinitiate federal action. The system didn't self-correct. It had to be publicly shamed for, a decade, before specific individuals in the Southern District of New York finally decided to act correctly.
Okay. Let's discuss that reinitiation, because it does bring us to the final point, the selective application of prosecutorial zeal. Prosecutors possess, as you know, a tremendous arsenal of structural advantages, essentially unfettered charging discretion, control over grand juries, powerful tools like conspiracy and RICO, the organized crime statutes. They can use the threat of a life sentence for a relatively minor offense, as outlined in cases like Bordenkircher, to force plea deals.
Exactly. And the failure to deploy this entire arsenal, wiretaps, search warrants, the mandatory detention presumption for child sex trafficking against Epstein, who had, by all accounts, over 100 victims, that is the system explicitly refusing to function for white elites. It reserves its most punitively powerful mechanisms for the racialized other, like those Ohio ministers whose wives received maximum sentences for relatively minor actions, like lying to investigators. That contrast is just stark.
The failure to deploy that arsenal, though, is still rooted in an individual selection process. The prosecutor decides which witnesses to call, which legal theories to pursue. The system could have worked, as the eventual SDNY indictment proved just before his death. But early on, prosecutors deliberately undermined the grand jury case. Think about the move, for instance, to introduce victim-blaming evidence, like victims' MySpace posts. This was apparently suggested despite Federal Rule of Evidence 412, the rape shield rule, which is designed precisely to bar irrelevant, inadmissible evidence because, legally, minors cannot consent. This feels like a conscious legal choice to sabotage the case, to make it less winnable, not merely an inert system failing to act.
But why does that individual conscious choice consistently seem to tilt in favor of white elites? I submit that this pattern of selective enforcement, this refusal to apply the full weight of the state's power, stems from the pervasive, deep-seated structural norms of, white heteropatriarchy that define who is deemed criminal and who is deemed worthy of leniency. The question is, why prosecutors experience such clarity of mind and unleashed their full power against black defendants, yet seemingly became weak in the knees, as the source puts it, when confronting a white financer? That, to me, feels systemic.
It is a profound demonstration of bias. Absolutely. But if we agree that the individual actions, ignoring established case law, violating victim rights, sabotaging evidence, were actively illegal, then we must focus accountability on reforming the enormous unchecked discretion granted to those powerful individuals. We have to ensure that a single state functionary cannot unilaterally dismantle a massive multi-victim criminal case under false legal pretenses ever again.
So for me, the Epstein saga remains a crucial, undeniable case study demonstrating that, because of these deep-seated systemic norms, the default mode of the American justice system is often one of leniency and protection for the powerful. And this is why transparency in prosecutorial decision-making, including, frankly, the demographic makeup of those prosecuting and those being prosecuted, is fundamentally necessary to challenge these structural inequalities.
And I'd agree, transparency is vital, but argue the core lesson from these egregious facts is that we must focus on accountability for the active corruption and dismantling of the case by individual prosecutors. We absolutely must rein in the unchecked discretion granted to state functionaries to prevent future individual abuses of power that shield influential wrongdoers, even as we acknowledge the systemic forces that, yes, enable them.
The continued pursuit of information through unsealed documents detailing high-profile associates and these ongoing civil lawsuits against financial institutions, it ensures that the fundamental question of who truly enables such global crimes and why they seem to remain above the rules will persist for the U.S. public.
Indeed. And the focus must remain on dismantling that wall of secrecy and ensuring that the financial sector, which clearly provided essential infrastructure for these global crimes, is never again able to simply look the other way.
Don't miss the next episode of The Debate. We rely on your critical engagement with these complex issues.